Welcome, I'm Jeff Nyquist. This is another edition of Friends and Enemies, where we talk about America and Europe's enemies and how America and Europe should be friends. Contrary to some of the recent narratives we see today, the issue of communism, and of course, people really don't like when I talk about communism. It's like, communism, that doesn't exist anymore. There's no more communism. It's a complicated subject because you go to graduate school anywhere and they're going to be shoving Marx in your face, and they're going to be shoving ideas like, we want to redo Marx's project. We want to bring you into this new glorious state of the world that man could be. You have the analysis of Eric Voegelin, who talked about Gnosticism, that all modern movements, from Freud's, well, it wasn't a movement, but Freud's psychology, Nazism, communism, all these things that limit human freedom, all these things that bring with them a kind of authoritarianism, were Gnostic movements. What did he mean by that, saying that communism was a Gnostic movement? You could even say, the ultra-liberalism is a Gnostic movement. Why? Because they believe that the universe, the way it was put together, was wrong. Whatever is wrong in this universe can only be fixed by man. Man has to become God, and being God, he has to remake the universe. He has to make the universe he lives in. He has to reshape himself. There is no fixed human nature, because if there was a fixed human nature, we couldn't do anything about it. We couldn't make a utopia. We couldn't cure all the ills that afflict mankind. So we have to believe that we have this power to transform ourselves into gods and to make the Garden of Eden on earth. These are kind of Gnostic notions that Voegelin said were behind Nazism. And you have this symbolism where there's this hinting that the figures who are leading the movement are godlike. For example, Hitler in the 1,000-Year Reich. Well, that was Christ. When the lion lays down with the lamb and there's 1,000 years of peace, Christ's return. That's just lifted wholesale out of Christian apocalyptic literature, right? So then you have, with the Soviets, of course, they've got their utopia too, and they're apocalyptic revolutionary storms. They're, you could say, 7 years of tribulation or 70 years. Marx said it could take generations for the revolution to be realized, generations of blood and violence. But at the end, when we see the Bolshevik Revolution, the revolutions where communism took over in places in Africa and Latin America, Asia, China, for example, you had tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people dying. I mean, by some accounts, over 100 million people were killed by communism in the 20th century. The famines, the terror famines, by the way, the putting people against the wall and shooting them, the killing fields of Cambodia by the Khmer Rouge, the starvations in Africa, so this is a real thing that communism brings about. And then, of course, Nazism. Why do these modern movements claim more lives than any religious persecution in the past? And the question arises, was communism a religion? Well, it's fascinating. The last ideology chief of the Soviet Union, Alexander Yakovlev, said that, well, Stalin and the Stalinists made Marxism-Leninism into a religion, but it's not. It's supposed to be a science. And being a science, we need to be scientific. We need to correct the initial mistakes of Marx and Lenin, and we have to join with the West. We have to converge with the West and figure this all out together. Of course, that all came to an end when Boris Yeltsin told President Clinton that he had one thing to do, and that was to give Europe to Russia. And Clinton said, well, they don't want me to give themselves to Russia. I can't give you Europe. And Yeltsin said, well, there's a new sheriff in town, and his name is Vladimir Putin. That really happened. That's in the transcript of Boris Yeltsin and Bill Clinton's last meeting. They were really expecting, the Russian communists to converge. And Boris Yeltsin, there's a video of Boris Yeltsin saying, well, we really haven't given up socialism. Even though he was attacking Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy, Yakovlev, the man in charge of that orthodoxy, said, well, there isn't an orthodoxy, right? We want to get together with the Western Marxists and make this project work by fixing our mistakes, So anyway, Alex, with that introduction, my co-host Alex Benesch in Germany has got some things about, what is it, spies, Russian spies in Germany?
Lots of them. And the way they act, it tells us a lot. Now, for a long time in the West, we were convinced God is good, God is perfection, and it's our guiding light. God is good, the devil is bad. Now, the communists said, wait a minute, we just stole some much older ideas about entities, about demons, right? Because there used to be the belief of a variety of demons, and you could make deals with them, you can trade with them, you can ask them for help.
Wait a minute, they stole what?
You can ask them for help, you can employ the services of a demon in exchange for something. This is kind of like a much older idea that was very common in Europe.
Ross made a bargain with Mephistopheles, right?
In the ancient world, and this is like something that I see over and over again when it comes to Russia and communism as it is today, because there's never a point where things are too evil. There's never a point where these supporters of the Russian regime or the Chinese regime, these propagandists or these collaborators, there's never a point when they say, okay, this is where I'm out. This is where it's too much for me. When the invasion of Ukraine happened, they all said, yeah, it's illegal, but it's okay. It's okay. It's acceptable. Now they say, well, a bunch of people are dead, but it's still okay. It's still okay because Russia is still fighting the New World Order. It's still fighting. We're still fighting the West and what the West stands for. And there's no bigger devil than the West. It's the great Satan. It's also what the Islamists believe. It's this great Satan, and to beat Satan, you kind of have to work with demons, with entities. You have to become sort of evil yourself to be able to compete, to maybe win against the devil. Now, there was no greater fall from grace, imagine grace, of course, for the European communists, the Western European communists, when more and more facts started to come out about the Gulag system in the Soviet Union, and how many people were suffering and dying in the Gulag system. They were struggling so hard in Western Europe to condemn the Gulag system, and the French got more enraged than some others, but all in all, the European communists said, well, all in all, it's okay. We have to live with it. We have to live with these large camp structures, forced labor, people dying en masse, people get shipped into these camps for speaking out or for no good reason whatsoever. It's okay. We have to accept it because we have to fight the devil. It's America. It's the Anglos. We have to fight the devil, and in order to win against the devil, we have to be kind of sort of demonic. We have to be really, really harsh and dark, and so there's never a point where they will stop. And so ultimately, if communism, if the Russians, the Chinese, if there's no limit to what they are willing to do, they become devil-like. I mean, they've been selling this idea for such a long time that the West is the devil, anything else is better than that. This also extends to the vastly controlled conspiracy movement. It's always the same thing. There's the devil, and we can't beat the devil if we're just good, right? And so when we hear about something like the Jeffrey Epstein case, right, and something of that nature, this financing guy who had his network, and they were shipping these young girls to him, and he was trying to befriend everybody, and he was trying to get into business with anybody who was important. There's also a Russian connection that most people are completely unaware of for the Epstein case, but all in all, it's perceived as a Western case. Okay, and so the Russian propaganda and by and large communist propaganda, they jumped on the Epstein case and said, look, this is proof, evidence that the West is the devil. It's absolute devil, right? There's nothing worse than the West. And people don't know about, in the West, they don't know about all these Epstein characters in the East and what they're doing and what they're willing to do. And there's people over there that they make Epstein look pale in comparison. They make Epstein look like, just a guy with money who liked underage girls. But there's so much worse. And you also have to understand the quantity and the quantity and the level of evil and how systematic it is and how intentional it is. Now, I've put together some notes here, different cases I think that explain this principle a lot. And it's about the first thing is about an old friend of Vladimir Putin when they were still in Leningrad KGB circles, and they were all handpicked by Arbatov, and they were supposed to transform the Soviet Union according to the tastes and personalities of people in the East and the West, because pure Marxism was still a big thing, but it was too limited. So of course they had to expand, and they had no limit to what measures and methods they would employ to rebuild the Soviet Union. Now, people have heard the term mafia a lot. You hear that a lot in books by Catherine Belton and others that have written about the Russian sphere. The assassinations in Russia, people that strayed too far from the KGB line, people that wanted something else. It always sounds so simple, right? When you say, yeah, well, it's kind of like mafia structures and some people get killed here and there. But it's more like a demonic, very demonic structure. These guys do not want to get outdone by anybody, and it's so devious and it's so dark that this whole argument falls apart. That the West is the devil, and you have to accept all this demonic stuff from the East to beat the devil. Now, here's a piece. This is from The Insider. This is has the headline, "From KGB Agent and Pimp to Monaco Aristocrat, How a Family of Russian Spies Became European Tycoons." It's about Vladimir Stralkovsky. In the 90s, he was Putin's acquaintance from the Leningrad KGB. He was in the tourist business and ran a side hustle as a pimp. When Putin came to power, Stralkovsky squeezed his way into the government and later secured the post of CEO at Nornickel, one of Russia's mining giants. Now, the former KGB agent and his son, also a trained Russian spy, have settled in Europe, where they created a group of companies that includes luxury spa hotels, Italy and Greece, places in Austria, half a dozen restaurants in Moscow, alcohol producers in Italy, France, and the Czech Republic. The Stralkovskys became cozy with European aristocrats. Now, this is what we talked about in previous episodes when the Russians, they want to get close to some older European structures, because that's kind of the perfect entry point into the West, especially an entry point into the United States. And so they go through this. They run through this case here. One of these companies was involved in prostitution, a fact that came to light during a hearing of a case on pandering in December of 1998 in the county court of the Finnish city of Kouvola. According to the court ruling, the Neva travel agency organized more than 2,000 trips of Russian sex workers to the Finnish towns of Lapinjärvi and Valkeala from January 96 to October 97. Blah, 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 blah. So, now of course, if you know how Russia works, you know that there's so much poverty in the population, but you can still find the pretty young poor girls from all these different places, big places and small places. Now they used to do this old school, back then, modeling contests. Oh, here's a casting, go to these casting things and you can get out of poverty, you can have a career, blah, blah, blah. And then they end up in sex work, and some of them may or may not have been recruited by the KGB to perform tasks. Of course, the KGB could ensure that these young girls would perform these operations because, if their families are back home in Russia, they would be targets for retribution. And so you find these young, very pretty girls, and you bring them in, and then you ship them to places like Finland, right? And Europe is a very tightly packed space, okay? You go to most places in Europe, everything's crammed full of people. The cities are huge, and there's people crawling everywhere. And everybody knows everybody. So if you have these girls and you have customers, you find these customers. One guy might work for the government. One might work for a telecommunications company. One may be a politician. One guy may be a judge. One guy may be an influential doctor. And so you can get to people, you can secretly film them and recruit them for producing information, delivering information, or do something else. And when you get this one person, you can also affect that person's family, right? And it's like the whole menu of KGB operations is conceivable when you're dealing with these 5-star prostitutes, these young girls. And so you film some European guy, in a hotel, for example, and then you reel him in. You say, yeah, we have this material on you, but we also want to work with you. We want to give you money, and you can buy nice things for your wife, and your wife is going to adore you, and your neighbors are going to adore you because now you have more money. And so this is how these things happen. This is how they will rot a place like Europe. And then you see the funny stuff happening. You see more and more European businesses and European politicians start to say, do we really like the Americans? Do we really like America? Do we really need America? I think America is annoying. I think it's, we don't like the tariffs, even though there's been a huge trade deficit between the European Union and America. But we don't like the Americans. It's all unfair, and we don't like them. And, maybe we should look elsewhere. And this is happening more and more and more over the years, especially since 1991, because now people can travel back and forth. This people can get smuggled over the border. When there's a big soccer tournament, like the World Cup or the European Soccer Cup, there's a bazillion prostitutes being shipped in from Eastern Europe or from further back east, shipped into Western Europe to serve the customers. I mean, can you imagine what a disaster that is in terms of espionage and counter-espionage? Because we don't have the capabilities. We don't have the big professional spy agencies that can disrupt all these operations, right? It's just too big. It's just too vast. And it says here, after Putin won the presidency in the spring of 2000, Strelkovsky's career continued its meteoric rise. He was appointed chairman of the Russian State Committee for Physical Culture, Sports, and Tourism. And of course, this is how you can get people to travel. This is how you can be an international guy if you're into sports and tourism. Then he became deputy to Russia's Minister of Economic Development and Trade, blah, 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 blah. And then, of course, the mining giant Norilsk Nickel. This is where all the big money apparently came from. And then it says how a bank in Cyprus linked the KGB man to some people in Donald Trump's entourage. Interesting. Now, there's a whole big story about Cyprus. Maybe one day we're going to do a whole episode on Cyprus and these funky banks that exist in Cyprus and these phony companies, because it's like a special zone. You know, it's kind of close to all the interesting places in Europe, but it's a special zone. You can do special things, you know, in Cyprus, and you know. So it says here, Strelkovsky placed at least half of his Russian severance package in a family account with the Cyprus Popular Bank. Blah, blah, blah. Then these assets were transferred to the Bank of Cyprus. Blah, 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 blah. And so they had to move things around because of the financial crisis. As a result, Strelkovsky became deputy chairperson of the bank's board and the head of the risk committee. Great. Incidentally, the list of the bank's major shareholders also came to include 4 individuals directly or indirectly linked to Donald Trump. One of them is Russian oligarch Dimmitri Boloflev, a figure in Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller's investigation into suspicious Florida property deal. In 2004, Trump bought a plot of land with a mansion in Florida for $41 million. At the height of the 2008 crisis, Trump urgently needed money. Bolovlev purchased the mansion from him, not at a discount, but for $95 million. 95, and the initial price was $41 million. The Russian later resold the plot at a loss for only $30 million. Blah, blah, blah. And then Dmitry Bolovlev's press service provided some statements here. The property was subdivided into 3 separate plots, which was sold at a profit, supposedly. And the final report by Special Counsel Robert Mueller contained no accusations against Dmitry Bolovlev. Blah, blah, blah. Another major shareholder of the Bank of Cyprus, the man who put Strelkovsky on its board of directors, is American billionaire Wilbur Ross. Ross had worked with Russia in the 1990s as a board member of the U.S.-Russia Investment Fund, promoting American business interests in the country. He specialized in transactions involving distressed assets, one of which was a Cypriot bank. Ross has featured in many scandalous stories, was very close to Trump, serving as the future president's economic advisor during his first campaign before taking the job of Secretary of Commerce. Great! Another member of the board of directors was Maxim Goldman, who represented oligarch Viktor Vekselberg's Renova Group. Vekselberg subsequently turned out to be one of Trump's campaign donors, and the FBI discovered that Trump's fixer, Michael Cohen, had received hundreds of thousands of dollars from Vekselberg's firms for consulting services. Also, some Democrats were also involved with Mr. Vekselberg as well, just for your information. And the board of directors was headed by another individual connected with Vekselberg, Ysef Akaman, director of Renova Management AG. Now, that name sounds familiar. Where have I heard that name before? Maybe a Bilderberg conference of some sort. Ysef Akaman. There it is. Akaman is notable not only as Vekselberg's man, but also as a former director of Deutsche Bank. And I believe he was a regular guest at the Bilderberg conferences. Now, the Deutsche Bank also loaned a lot of money to Donald Trump when he desperately needed money, and the Deutsche Bank was also fined for some funky business involving money that was supposedly linked to Russia. During his tenure as executive director in 2002-2012, Deutsche Bank committed several financial irregularities. That's a nice way to put it. The largest of which involved laundering $10 billion. $10 billion of Russian money through offices in New York, Moscow, and Cyprus. The bank was fined more than $670 million in 2017 for these violations. One of the bank's top customers turned out to be none other than Donald Trump. His 2016 financial disclosures showed that he had loans with Deutsche Bank totaling $364 million to be repaid before 2024. Right. Now, of course, these Westerners are not stupid either, right? I mean, it's not like it's like stealing candy from a kid, infiltrating the West. The West is not completely stupid. There was also kind of this Henry Kissinger-ish idea of, let's all trade with each other, let's all become friends with each other, let's all party with each other, and maybe we can create a stable world system. That was Henry Kissinger's big pitch for a long time. And it also included this idea that the Russians were going to copy some Western history in a shorter amount of time. Going from sort of aristocratic types to the robber barons, and then a more broad system of republic, democracy, more capitalism, not just robber barons. And it's like, the KGB played that part. They presented these KGB assets as oligarchs, and it seemed to fit on the surface this Henry Kissinger idea that the Russians were ultimately going to become like us. They just had to do this on speed run mode, and go through these different stages that we had already gone through. But KGB will always be KGB. If you get a position, if you get the money, if you get these operations, you can't go back. I mean, there's been KGB assets that at some point said, I'm done. I'm too much of an alcoholic. I can't do this anymore. I'm just gonna go silent for a while. Please give me another, or please give me I want to have a contact opportunity for maybe me returning from retirement. I need still contact to the Moscow center, KGB. But other than that, I'm gonna not be active for a while, or maybe I'm not gonna be active forever. Now that's some assets. It's some assets. But if the KGB put that much into you, you can never go back, right?
Well, what I was going to talk about is what has happened to the Russian system. And originally Lenin, remember, who formed the party, he's following the Communist Manifesto, which talks about when they take power, they have to take despotic power. Initially, this became called the dictatorship of the proletariat, overthrowing what the communists called the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And people used to say to Lenin, why are you standing over there with all these criminal types? You've got all these thugs around you. And Lenin would laugh at them, and they would say, oh, you legal Marxists, you want to do everything through democracy. You want to be nice about everything. I can't make a revolution with you intellectuals. I can make a revolution with these thugs here. And thus he had people like Stalin, who was an intellectual thug, I guess you could say, a guy who robbed banks, and but who also read a lot of books. The evolution of the Soviet power from the Bolshevik Revolution or coup of October 1917, actually November, new calendar, that revolution evolved a regime. Remember, Marx thought that this dictatorship was going to be temporary. Lenin said, well, Marx was all about action. His theories weren't necessarily right. We may need these institutions for a while. And then you had Stalin come in, and he formed the Soviet Union as general secretary, and then, it went on through until his death. And it was a system supposedly with a command economy. And the great problem was, how does that work? When private property, other than the stuff that you personally own, is all owned by the state, when all the property that is in business is owned by the state, and all buying and selling is completely controlled by the state, by Interior Ministry, police, and the KGB. What is that? What are you creating? Well, human beings can't live like that. The most basic thing in human life is the right to buy and sell. So you ended up having evolving a black market economy side by side, because, as pointed out by one leftist, the police always organize the organized crime. And in the Soviet Union, the police and the party, the major politicians, they did organize it. So even when you had Stalin, this was going on. Of course, Stalin was continually purging and killing people. He was catching people. And you had this system of terror. When Stalin died, they wanted to get rid of it. And by the time Brezhnev comes in, they're all very comfortable, because the rule is you don't kill fellow party members. You don't put them against the wall. So the head of the Interior Ministry police under Brezhnev was completely corrupt. He was up to his neck in the mafia. And while the KGB was running around persecuting dissidents and so on, and recruiting Western businessmen, the MVD, the Interior Ministry police, were running the mafia. And of course, you couldn't, you had Brezhnev, you had the party, the army, and the KGB, the Iron Triangle, that a bunch of guys with guns pointed at each other's heads. And that was how the system worked. Well, then they had this idea, according to defectors Golitsyn and Shana and Bittman, and others. Robert Buchar wrote a book and did a documentary on this. The collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the Velvet Revolution, the Solidarity, everything that happened, they would take over dissident movements. They created, Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. They had controlled dissidents. They created a dissident movement and hijacked dissidents. They wanted to make sure that there was going to be a revolution in Russia, if there was going to be one, in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet bloc. They were going to be in control of it, and they were going to be able to guide it. And so that's what ended up happening. They then unleashed, under Gorbachev, they had the economic reforms. Well, who were in a position to do this? The Interior Ministry police, the KGB, and of course, the leaders in the Communist Party, who were in bed with the Mafia. And they were to reorganize the economy in a way that looked like they created billionaires by having contracts signed. Konstantin Brzezinski told me, Marina Kalashnikova, the historian, how Khodorkovsky, how Boris Berezovsky got to be oligarchs. They signed contracts with the KGB. That
they don't own anything. That they have to follow orders, give everything back if asked. They couldn't refuse. If they were asked to give everything back, they would have to give everything back.
They were owners, but they were owners as a kind of what do you call it? They were custodians. They were not billionaires like you have in the West, where the person owns their own money and their rights are protected by the courts and by the laws. The property rights are enforceable in the West. In the East, it was a power arrangement for the purposes of KGB, Interior Ministry police operations. And also it became a mode, because this whole system was so corrupt. I mean, Brezhnev's head of Interior Ministry police lived on the floor below him. And whenever he was afraid Brezhnev would see what he was doing, he would come up and get on his knees and cry and make these speeches about how he was keeping he couldn't let the KGB unleash the KGB on the Interior Ministry police, because then Andropov would take over the country and purge the party, and they'd return to the bloodshed of Stalin, right? Yeah. So they always used, it was the way the regime evolved. And so it's very interesting when you get to then the carrying out of perestroika, the carrying out of glasnost. You had the party ideology chief was Alexander Yakovlev. He'd come from the ideology department. They made him ambassador to Canada. He got very close to Pierre Trudeau, the more recent Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau's father, and even named one of his sons after Alexander Yakovlev. Yakovlev comes from this coolness in Canada, comes back to and ultimately becomes a Politburo member, and says, look, he starts saying, and this is with Gorbachev's permission, He says, look, we Soviet intellectuals, we know that Marx and Lenin made mistakes. We know that Stalinism was horrible. We know that Stalin turned Marxism, Leninism into a religion when Marx said and Lenin said that it was just Marxism is a science of management of human affairs to form the intellectual hub that was the vanguard of the revolution, to lead mankind into this paradise, this classless paradise, where these brutal relations of bourgeoisie and employee would be ended, and everybody would own everything in common, and everything would just work out fine. There's a way to get there. So, I still believe in socialism, Yakovlev, a Soviet ideology. I mean, after all, it's the Soviet Socialist Republics. We just need to rethink it. And of course, he started repeating things that were circulating in Western universities, where Marxist professors are quite numerous in Western universities. Things that they were saying about, don't read the later Marx, Das Kapital is garbage, read the early Marx. Yakovlev is saying the same thing. We need to rethink the Marxist project, and then we can have convergence, right? Because the intellectual brain of the West is really Marxist. The intellectual brain of the Soviet Union is Marxist. We can have convergence. This is what Andrei Sakharov, the inventor of the hydrogen bomb, he wrote a whole book on this, a whole series of essays in the late 60s. I have the copy of them right here. And so this was all, with the reforms and bringing people out of exile in the Soviet Union and allowing freedom of speech and creating a market economy under Gorbachev and reforming the party. This was all part of these gimmicks. And of course, the people who believed, this is what Yakovlev said, we have to get rid of Marxism, Leninism as a religion that people believe in stupidly because it's really about the science. Well, what ends up happening is, of course, they stub their toe. The West isn't really, the Western Marxists and the Western governments aren't really that interested in converging with Russia. So they are very patient. They have Boris Yeltsin, who, by the way, on video, Boris Yeltsin said, well, we really haven't given up socialism. There's a little caveat there. He's also been attacking Marxism, Leninism and the old neo-Stalinists, but he's not. And, the people in the Soviet Union, they heard something a little different. It's like, oh, they're going to change everything? Oh, we're going to get to be free. That's all they heard. And of course, what ends up happening is you end up getting a kind of runaway train. It got away from them. In Germany in particular, the unification of Germany did not happen slowly as they'd hoped. It happened quickly. Gorbachev went ahead with his negotiations. He did not secure this promise that was offered by Secretary of State Baker to not one step further to the east for NATO. That was never in a treaty. Nations don't casually, foreign minister doesn't casually make a promise to a secretary.
Just what was commonly believed at the time,
Baker made the offer, and in the transcript of the meeting, Gorbachev just talked over him and didn't respond to it. And there was no negotiation about that. There was no real agreement made. In fact, even while Gorbachev was negotiating with Kohl, your Chancellor Kohl, Hungary, the Hungarians and the Poles were asking, is there a way we could, join NATO, that we could join the West, that we could get out of this? And there was no reaction from Moscow. There was none. Why? Because the people making the offer were Soviet agents, and they were communists, right? We just want to get into the tent. You think that you would think that the West was cheating Russia, but Russia was trying to cheat the West. The communists in Russia were trying to look. We could fill NATO up with communist countries. We could get the Soviet Union into NATO. I mean, Gorbachev actually asked that at one point, and it was then Baker's turn to be silent and like, what do I say to that? The Soviet Union joining NATO? That would be awkward.
Putin did offer some substantial support to the Bush administration, when with the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. So this is kind of the theater that the Russians played, that they would cooperate with NATO, that they would.
Yes, yeah.
But behind America's back, the Russians were the Russians were amplifying conspiracy media against the Bush admin on a massive scale.
Well, it's a complicated story because they had a moment there when Yeltsin was in. They let these oligarchs like Guzinski controlled this TV channel that had satire. I mean, they had TV that was making fun of the Russian government, making fun of Yeltsin, making fun of Putin. And in fact, when Putin was prime minister, they started to crack down. And when he was president, Guzinski was given a choice. First, he was jailed, and it's like, well, if you sign over all your property, we'll let you go to Israel and let you keep this little amount to live on. So Guzinski fled to Israel, and the media was taken over bit by bit by Putin and his gang. And what triggered this change? Why did they go from Yakovlev saying we're going to have freedom here. We're going to defeat Marxism as a religion. We're going to have it as a science, and we're going to combine with the West, and we're going to make a better world. What happened was that Boris Yeltsin met with Bill Clinton in December, face-to-face in December of 1999. And he started, calling Clinton on the carpet. Now, Clinton in his youth was a Marxist. There's a lot of evidence for that, and his wife too. Clinton was in the anti-war movement. When he was on Oxford on foreign soil, not on American soil, he was protesting against the Vietnam War. He got a free trip to the Soviet Union and to Czechoslovakia.
Also, there was this idea, I think this came out of Western Europe and then made its way to the US. It's this idea that if you're on the left, if you want socialism, to a degree, in a specific way, you are encouraged in the West to work for big business and to be involved in big business, because ultimately it's going to be taken over. So this is where this disconnect comes from, as some people see on the surface when somebody is, like Clinton or his Bill Clinton or his wife, working for big law firms or big and working for big clients and stuff. But this is all part of a Marxist playbook as well. So this should not fool anybody.
What Boris Yeltsin confronted Clinton was, he said, Bill, I still believe in you, but we want we just want one thing from you: give Europe to Russia. And they had this discussion. It was surrealistic, and Bill Clinton is like aghast, and he's like saying, well, they don't want me to give them to you, and Yeltsin went on, I'm sitting in Moscow. I'm in a European city. You go defend those countries over there. We're Europeans. We should be in charge of defending Western Europe, So it's like, it was just remarkable. And then Yeltsin mentioned this Eurasian thing, which of course we see has come out through Dugin. He said, we're a Eurasian country, and Bill Clinton, being a smart aleck, said, so you're gonna ultimately own Asia too, And so it was a very funny thing, and when Clinton would not give in to Yeltsin's harangue and arguments, and Yeltsin didn't sound a bit drunk, by the way, he sounded very clear if you read the transcript. And it was declassified in 2018, very interesting, by the Bill Clinton Archive library. You can go online and you can go through all of the meetings that he had with Boris Yeltsin, their transcripts, and it's the last one of their face-to-face meetings. There's a phone call they have when he resigns the presidency of the Russian Federation. But that is just amazing, and for the president of the Russian Federation to make such a demand, and for it to have been kept secret all this time. Why was this document classified? Everybody should have known that Russia had asked the United States for Europe in 1999. Everybody should have known that happened. And it's a fantastic request, but it shows this was what the pretense of liberalism under Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and of course with the intellectual brain power of Alexander Yakovlev behind it. This is what they were trying to do. They were trying to get the Western Marxists, and they considered the Clintons to be closet Marxists, get them to actually follow through and help them do the convergence without a nuclear war. NATO had all these defenses to prevent the Russian tank armies from coming across. We had nuclear minefields in your country, in Germany, Then we had nuclear-equipped troops with tactical nuclear weapons. We had our strategic nuclear weapons. We were ready to fight World War III.
Yeah, and by the way,
came through Europe.
Yeah, but I mean, I distinctly remember the 90s. I mean, the Clinton era, right? And now I understand this era even better because when you're asking yourself what was the image of America in Europe at the time in the 90s and how it changed under George W. Bush and all this leftist propaganda that became a bigger thing, and the conspiracy propaganda became a bigger thing. Now in the 90s, the 90s saw a grand strategy of soft power, right? This is when American culture was very, very strong in Europe. You know, the music, the shows, and it was like this. The people had this impression that people here had this impression that the Clinton era was hopeful. It was positive. Finally, the Cold War is over. All that grimness and nastiness and militarism, all that's gone now. It's a new era, and we're gonna be focusing on fun things, you know. And there was this saxophone playing U.S. president who seemed like a chill guy, and it all seemed so new. And it saw a fundamental shift in culture because in the 80s, American culture was also extremely successful in Europe, but it was different. You know, it was the action movies, it was Sylvester Stallone movies and Arnold Schwarzenegger movies and Chuck Norris movies. You know, when Chuck Norris would be fighting the communists in different movies, and you had these almost superheroes who would go to any length to destroy the enemy and protect people. And this all went away. You know, suddenly in the 90s, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who became, of course, a politician in the United States later, Arnold Schwarzenegger in the 90s was playing family-friendly comedy movies. It was comedy. Suddenly, all these guys, they played character roles in comedies, and it was all about feeling good, and you know, it was almost like in a cultural sense, it was almost a bit like magic. You know, everything seemed so hopeful and just focus on pleasure and nice things and not worry about security, not worry about anything anymore. That was a very, very big thing, and I think that nobody should ever underestimate that. Because it's one thing if you have a war in Chechnya, right? And people just kind of ignored it here for the most part. And it's one thing if, like, in a tense global situation, countries exchanging some threats and people stop paying attention to it at some point. But if you have like the soft power cultural and political strategy, it really affected people. I mean, there's still nostalgia here about the 90s when everything seemed calm finally. You know, the dark days are over, no more Reagan, no more Bush Sr., no more militarism. Now it's going to be fun. And that was something, that was a big theater where Clinton played a major role, and that had a tremendous effect on Europe. Of course, the perception changed with Bush, and then...
Well, to show what the Yakovlev, as the ideology chief of the Soviet Union, was doing, in 1989, Nikolai Popov, who was a professor of historical sciences, that means he was a Marxist-Leninist, professor of Marxism-Leninism studies, really, wrote a piece called "We're All in the Same Boat" in the Literaturная Gazeta. And this is a passage that kind of tells you what this is about, what these changes in the Soviet Union were about. He said, "Therefore, our main task today, in addition to an honest analysis of our past and an elimination of the remnants of Stalinism in our domestic policy and psychology, is to divorce Stalinism from communism in the eyes of the world." Now notice, he's not getting rid of communism, he's divorcing Stalinism from communism. And then he goes, at the cost of incredible effort. Now he's explaining why they have to do this. At the cost of incredible effort, we created an atomic bomb and then a hydrogen bomb and an arsenal of missiles. And by the end of the 60s, we reached parity with the United States and the West. But we did not manage to protect ourselves from danger with offensive missiles. And the danger of war increased. You know, this is a nuclear war. They know, they realize that if they're going to win, they have to fight a nuclear war. And it's like, well, this is too dangerous. And so they go, it is possible to avert it, as our present government constantly emphasizes, only through political and not military means. In this sense, glasnost is our parity, restructuring is our weapon, and de-Stalinization is our main ammunition. And you see what and this is a very frank admission you see things like this in the Soviet press in that time, but this is the clearest one that you see, because he's really just stating it flatly. Well, we don't want we want to take over the world in a nuclear war, so we're gonna do it politically, and we're gonna separate Stalinism from communism in the eyes of the world, which is what Yakovlev was doing, appealing to the Western Marxists. Because I was in 1989, I was in graduate school at UC Irvine in political science, and most of the graduate students, and I would say more than half the professors, were either socialists of some kind or they were outright Marxist-Leninists, and they all regarded Stalin, as Khrushchev had denounced Stalin in 1956. The head of the Soviet Communist Party had denounced Stalin long before. Stalinism was a failure. The USSR was a disappointment. So what these guys are doing is they're saying, we're not going to be a disappointment anymore. And to my graduate school in 1988, in December of 88, you had the head of the Institute of Canada and USA Studies, Georgy Arbatov, who had been a Stalin advisor, ironically, came to speak to our colloquium, our Friday colloquium. And because we would have guest speakers every week, and he was the guest speaker. I mean, a pretty powerful guest speaker, right? An advisor of Gorbachev. And he gave this speech that we are going to take away the image of your enemy, and that's going to completely, to be a great empire, America needs an evil empire to oppose. Well, we're going to take away that evil empire. We're not going to be evil anymore. And this was a year before the Berlin Wall came down, almost a year before. It's just a remarkable thing to sit and watch Arbatov do this, because he's basically saying, we're doing this on purpose. We're pulling down the Soviet image, the neo-Stalinism of Brezhnev. We're getting rid of the totalitarian state. We're not going to be bad anymore. And what are you going to do? You're going to have to give in to us. And of course, he received, they were just agog over him, these professors who were socialists. How happy we don't have to sit there and fight Ronald Reagan, because Reagan's fighting the evil Soviet Union. We can all embrace socialism, because now socialism is going to be good. It's not going to be evil anymore. Well, you see, Yakovlev and all these intellectuals and Nikolai Popov and all the rest of them, and Gorbachev, it didn't work, because the Western intellectuals didn't want to converge with poor, dilapidated Russia. They didn't recognize the capitalists in the West were like, this is a bit like the Wild West. We kind of want to invest. And people did, like British Petroleum. There was a lot of investment, but everybody that invested in Russia in the 90s lost their money. I can't think of anyone. I asked a guy that set up the cell phone system in the former Soviet Union for a Swedish company, and I said, did anybody in Russia make money investing in it? He said no. Eventually the British Petroleum executives, they just refused to give them visas. They couldn't even go to visit their 49% of control in and assets in the Russian oil industry. So it was a giant cheat. And the defector, Colonel Stanislav Lunev, I remember I was with him, and a journalist said, Colonel Lunev, what would you advise people investing in the former Soviet Union? He said, don't invest in them, you're going to be ripped off. You're going to be robbed. The Chinese play a longer game with that. People have made money in China, but eventually they're going to appropriate every bit of American and Western investment in China too. Because why? Because they're a communist country. And so what it ended up being is when this attempt to fool the West and get the West to openly engage and converge peacefully did not work. And they couldn't get someone like Clinton to budge, and then NATO was moving further because all these countries were starting to really want their freedom, and they were losing control of the political process in countries like Poland and countries like Romania and the Baltic states. They realized they had made a mistake. So who was discredited within the Soviet power structure? Alexander Yakovlev and Gorbachev and all the intellectuals who tried this experiment not to do nuclear war. So who comes in? Vladimir Putin, non-intellectual, not a guy who reads books, not a sophisticated guy, and his colleagues, the army generals and KGB generals and MVD people and the whole corrupt mass of people who believe Marxism-Leninism as a religion, not in a sophisticated way. And so they're back on the track with the subversion and the Eurasianism, and they're infiltrating the right and the left. And Putin is cynically pretending to be a Christian and a nationalist, when even in his most recent interview with Tucker Carlson, he spoke very straightforwardly like a communist, like a Marxist-Leninist, and actually said publicly, well, Marxism, Leninism, and Christianity, they're the same thing. He said that more than once. I've watched his statements. And also saying things like, well, I never burned my party card. I still have it. I didn't join the Communist Party Soviet Union just to get into the KGB. I joined it because I like socialist ideas, right? This is Vladimir Putin speaking. Why is he helping Cuba? Why is he building military infrastructure in communist Nicaragua? Why are there Russian troops in communist Venezuela? Why are they helping all these countries, Marxist-Leninist countries, however disguised in Africa, with Wagner mercenaries or with investment, with helping to arm them? Why are the North Korean communists helping him fight in Ukraine? Why is China helping him? Why does he have this unlimited partnership with communist China? Because Vladimir Putin's a communist. It's the same reason when he was at Sochi, he gave a speech on the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution in October of 2017, and it was the World Festival of Youth and Students, the biggest communist youth organization in the world.
He's breathing this stuff. I mean, ever since his
parents, future. Yeah, we're behind
ever since
you.
his family basically died because of the Nazis. The siege on Leningrad. Ever since that, and in the following years, this is how Vladimir Putin grew up. This is what he's all about. This is the defining phase of his life. His parents that almost died. I think his siblings
his brother died in the siege of Leningrad. His parents almost starved. Certainly,
and the misery that came afterwards, because we know now from all kinds of data points that growing up was not fun for Vladimir Putin. He was a scrawny kid. And he got bullied, he got beat up. Everybody was kind of criminal in the city, and the kids were criminal. And then he picked up judo, I think it was, a fighting sport, and he made a name for himself. He started to dominate people, and he wanted bigger things. He always wanted to join the KGB. That was his lifelong ambition. I mean, he grew up with these sword and shield movies and the television show about the glorious KGB. He wanted to be the biggest spy in the world, infiltrate the Germans.
17 Moments in Spring.
Yeah, infiltrate the Germans, go to the highest stages, and then just demolish and take over Germany. But he didn't look German, so this is kind of the only reason why. Well, one of the big reasons why they never sent him undercover to West Germany, because he just doesn't look German at all. But so he's breathing this stuff, and look at his fellow travelers. I mean, look at the Stralkovsky family, right? I mean, here's Yevgeny Stralkovsky. This is the son of the elder Strelkovsky, who the elder was a close ally, KGB ally of Putin, and this younger guy, Strelkovsky, was born in 1980. So he was a kid at the height of the Cold War. He was a child. Graduated from the Academy of the Foreign Intelligence Service, SVR, in 2001. Received military ID and started working under the cover of Benesch Bank. And so he was set up. I mean, he followed the family tradition, as it's very common. And then it says, when he was not busy spying, the younger Strelkovsky was fond of historical reenactments, but with a twist. He headed Morgil, which described itself as an alcoholic Nazi fanatic hooligan role-playing team. The group's ideology was expressed via the theory of rejects, which suggested there were normal people and rejects. So it was kind of old school and very violent and very crazy. It's almost like what the European right wing has been doing. Now sometimes even to this day, you see adult German men from these older right-wing networks. Some of them are very old, attached to universities, and they have these scars in their face, like the cheeks or the chin. They have these longer scars. That's from fencing. That's from real fencing, right? This is a tradition. These students would put on these goggles to protect their eyes, and they would start fencing, sometimes even when drunk, and then they would get cut in the face, and then you get stitched up, and that would mark you as a cool guy if you have that scar. And then he just kind of doubled. This guy, he had this double role. He was an agent. He was also an entrepreneur. And the old Strelkovsky became a citizen of Monaco, took charge of the family's foreign assets. There's all kinds of companies, with the and some British ties and all of that. And I was in Monaco last year on vacation. We saw some different places in the south of France, and you drive south, you go to Italy. You get to the coast, and you drive along the coast until you reach France, right? And then all the style changes. No more playful Italy. It's very serious. It's very, very, almost a bit German, I have to say, or more Roman, more stern Roman when you're in France. And in Monaco and in other places, we walked around these famous trails on the coast, and there was one going around one of the most expensive properties in the world, right at the ocean. Huge thing, huge security measures, and there's this tourist trail going around it because they can't forbid the common folks, the peasants, from walking around the property. But it was vacant because it was owned by some Russian guy, and the French kicked him out, and they took his mansion, interestingly enough. And this is kind of the stuff when these young KGB guys, they act like little princes. They act like little barons, little princes, and they have they're play acting these old some of these old traditions, and then they go to Monaco, and then they want to blend. They actually want to blend with these Europeans, and they buy their way into these KGB guys. They buy their way into wineries and in Malta, with Maltese companies and companies in Cypress, and they try to mingle. Because where's the best place to mingle? It's a place like Monaco, because there's all these rich people in Monaco, right? Influential people in Monaco. So this is where you go. This is where you go and you mingle. And you drive your sports car, and you have hotels, and you have the fancy watches. And this is then kind of the setup
that
they were using.
What we end up with now is that since Russia cannot win over the Western left, the infiltrating the right has become a priority, especially with the Dugin project, but also preparing for a future war, building up the Russian military, putting the Soviet Union back together again by, of course, first invading Georgia and sort of paralyzing Georgia by taking parts of it and then infiltrating back into Georgia, which they've done, and, of course, taking back Ukraine, which Ukraine went rather south on them, and they've had this big battle in Ukraine. But right now they're going through a mobilization, and this is what Lee Wheelbarger's intelligence collection is showing. Chinese train just arrived in Belarus near the Polish border, loaded with ammunition, all the way from Manchuria. The Russians have got probably 20 million gallons of diesel fuel sitting near the Savaki Gap in rail yards and in constructed fuel supply depots. They're creating new fuel. They turned an SS, it was in the parade, the May 9th parade, they turned an SS-27 carrier, the biggest vehicle in the world. They turned it into a triple gas station. It has 3 giant fuel tanks on it, huge, for carrying diesel fuel for vehicles, with all kinds of hoses in the back, so you could refuel all kinds of tanks and APCs, on the road. I mean, it's incredible what they have built, the logistical system they've built, and it can't be that much fuel just to invade the Baltic states. They're looking at invading Poland or going south into the rear of Ukraine. This buildup on the NATO's borders in Belarus and in Russia has been noted by the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks ago. Article about the buildup on the Finnish border. It is people don't realize, we don't know the numbers of people that Russia's putting in the army. I don't think we understand the number of people under training, and they're bringing foreigners in, training them in satellite training camps, military training camps around Minsk in Belarus. And then, of course, they brought a lot of nuclear weapons into Belarus, not just the ones that were initially admitted. Lukashenko had said that SS-27s would be brought in, but they've got multiple. Now we found several SS-27s looking at maps. I think Johnny Anderson found the first one looking at Lee's satellite data, and that one was 17 kilometers from the Polish border. Why do you put an ICBM that is can hit Antarctica 17 miles from the Polish border? What's with that? You don't need to be that close unless you're planning a surprise nuclear attack in which you're using a low trajectory firing of an SS-27 against, for example, the French nuclear deterrent, where you want to hit them in 6-7 minutes so they don't have time to launch or even mount a defense. You can't intercept a low trajectory SS-27. There's just no means to intercept something that moves that fast and has in-flight maneuvering capabilities. So this is what they're preparing. It is no joke. These are first strike weapons deployed in a first strike way, with troops lining up. Why would they go to the expense? I mean, mobilization is war. Why are you mobilizing millions of people? Why are you striking the names of skilled workers off the list of those who are prevented from being mobilized? Now you're going to mobilize your skilled workers? What you only do that in a world war. And this is what the Russians are doing now. We saw in April of 2021 them digging graves throughout Russia. The orders went out in April of 2021. We're digging graves in Russia. All the municipalities, you have to dig fresh graves. There are Russian citizens who drive through these graveyards with their iPhones, taking the pictures in row after row. What are they doing? Well, the whole thing was about graves for the soldiers that would be killed fighting in Ukraine. So we had early warning. If we only knew how to read the warning, and nobody read it. And so I think that together with their allies, the Chinese, who are also in the process of mobilizing slower than Russia, trying not to dislocate their economy in the process of mobilizing, struggling with whether they can survive an immediate decoupling from the United States, which is their intended victim who they've become economically entangled with. All these complexities are being worked out right now. And President Trump doesn't seem to understand. What would you say the German government understands all this is happening?
Well, it's like there's no harder place to read than Europe. Europe is such a tightly packed place, a flurry of different groups and individuals, and it's hard to say ultimately who plays for what side. I mean, this is kind of like this is the situation that we're in. I mean, here's an example. Here's an example of this. In the early 2000s, while congratulating FSB, Russian intelligence, FSB employees on Chekist Day, Nikolai Patrushev called the state security officers the new nobility. For Patrushev's colleagues, Vladimir and Evgeny Strelkovsky, integrating into the circles of real European aristocracy proved remarkably easy. Evgeny achieved this through the historical Medieval Battle International Association. This is like medieval combat, a full contact sport. Sounds crazy because it is. And participation in the historical sport likely helped Strelkovsky build a closer relationship with Prince Albert II of Monaco. A very old family, Prince Albert II of Monaco, who personally presented awards to tournament winners. Among those receiving recognition was Alexander Nikitin, deputy head of the specialized department of the Federal Bailiff Service of Russia in the Nizhny Novgorod region. And there's photos of Prince Albert II of Monaco and Evgeny Strelkovsky at this tournament in 2019. And there's a photo of Vladimir Strelkovsky receiving the Order of St. Anna of the First Class. Now, people have to remember, these older networks, and sometimes it's Catholic orders, it's very old Catholic networks and aristocratic networks, very powerful, very old. And these networks, they also have, they always linger in the background of German politics, especially conservative German politics, right? I mean, the mainline conservative party here, the CDU, they almost had a chancellor a few years ago who married into an older family, who was working for these guys, and who was a member of, or who was married into a family of a guy who was in one of the oldest Catholic orders, right? Was it the Knights Hospitallers or one of these? And this is how you mingle. And I mean, this makes it harder for the politicians to understand where this is going. I mean, is it classical KGB? Or do these KGB guys start to like the old ways and feeling like a prince? You know, this is like the Henry Kissinger idea of they will become like us. Don't worry. They will love our way of life. They will become like us. But no, these guys are just on an operation. They are running an op. They're always running an op because they can't do anything else. If anything, if you walk out of line, if you don't report a certain meeting, if you mingle in Europe, in Monaco, and you drive around in sports cars and you have like, you mingle, if you don't report everything that's important to the Moscow, to the center, to the KGB basically, if you don't report everything, they will find out. If your reports don't match other people's reports, you're in trouble. And we know the KGB will eat its own people. I mean, they will destroy you even if you're kind of high up. If you deviate from your assignment, if you like the Western ways too much. And I always thought that real Soviet communists, I mean, these real Soviet communists, they were the stern types. They were the super hyper-focused guys, the disciplined guys. You know, they were really serious people. And they would only indulge in fun if it was part of a mission. And they were very, very into that. And there was always a distinction between these Soviet-type communists and standard Western communists. Now, these Western guys, they could also be, you know, fanatic and blah, but they liked fun too much. They liked the things too much that deviated. And this is why Moscow would never trust these Western guys for the most part. And this is why Moscow would systematically destroy Western communist structures that were not in line. You know, when they had communist groups in Spain that were ratted out by Russian intelligence, or in Portugal or in other places like that, it was always going on. If there was some other socialism that was more like, yeah, let's try to be nicer, let's try to be cool, let's try to be not so evil, maybe, those groups were destroyed. Because they were always infiltrated. They would always be infiltrated by the real Soviet communists, and they would betray some communists to the Nazis. They would betray some communists to the fascists in Spain, like that, in a heartbeat. And so, are we really believing that these KGB guys have changed? That they became more like us? We really think that? I mean, it's asinine. It's asinine to believe that, but you know, when you mingle enough, when you do this for 20 years or 30 years, some European politicians, especially those who are in charge of handling, intelligence and counterintelligence, people tend to forget, right? Some people tend to forget. I mean, this one guy, this one Russian guy, I mean, he was groomed for that role, follow into his father's footsteps, become a KGB asset. But these Western guys, they're not the same anymore oftentimes. You know, these German politicians and others, back in the day, like decades ago, they still had a more serious background. Or they fought in the war, or they were running some operations. They were tough people. They had some grit. But the following generations, they were just lawyers. They were just like these dry and drab lawyer types, these social climbers. And now it's the drab lawyers against these KGB guys. And of course the West isn't completely dumb. Of course the West was trying to run some stuff, right? But who's playing whom? And here's another thing. It says, to be fair, the Stralkovskis do have aristocratic roots, but not Russian ones. Their family belonged to the Polish nobility and was mentioned in the list of families in the highest approved heraldry of the Kingdom of Poland. Vladimir even sponsored the publication of the book The Stralkovskis of the Polkosits Coat of Arms, 10 Centuries of a Knightly Family, a book written for him by a professor of Moscow State Regional University. Vladimir's passion for aristocratic titles goes beyond pride in his ancestors. Like Patrushev, he also sees himself among the new Russian aristocracy. In September 2005, the former KGB officer received hereditary nobility from Maria Vladimirovna Romanova of the House of Hohenzollern Romanov. In 2009, he was ennobled with the title of Knight of the Order of St. Anna of the First Class. The order was presented by Alexander Zakatov, the personal secretary of the imperial family and the director of the Russian Imperial House's office. This is the mess that we're in Europe. Now, you can't play the same nonsense in America, because in America there's no traditional aristocracy in America like we have here. But we have that, and that complicates everything, right? Because if you can blend, if you have these family ties and you wear the watches and you just, you have the sports cars and you try to appear just like these people here. But you're always on a mission. You're always acting. You always have to put up the act. And these KGB guys are not playing around. Because they would lose everything. They can lose everything. Because they have sisters and cousins and everything, and it's all being surveilled. They don't put that amount of power into an asset, into an officer, and give him these opportunities to travel, right? I mean, in the Soviet days, I mean, you needed special clearance to to travel. You could not necessarily bring your family over for a vacation because you might just run, right? I mean, this is like, I mean, what do you think about these current generation KGB guys traveling like that in Europe and owning these houses? They were free to leave Russian soil and just come over. I mean, what level of trust does it require from the KGB to have these people running around? Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is that the culture, the Soviet culture, the way Soviet culture works is toxic, and it goes to a mafia culture. Lenin began with criminals, and he ends with criminals and thugs. And this religion that they believe in gives them the feeling that they're holy. They're going to create something better for mankind. But really what they're doing day to day is that they're using their position, their control over the economy to enrich themselves. Because you don't put policemen and revolutionaries in charge of an economy because, all right, you can't buy and sell. You can't do anything. You have to wait for my permission. All right. What's available out there? All right, I'm taking a cut here. You can buy and sell, but I'm taking a cut. And this is what they ended up doing. This is the black market. Whenever you create a monopoly, a control with men with guns over an economy, over people's livelihoods, they end up taking a cut, like gangsters. They end up, it's protection money, whatever. We the state can produce. We have the state power. We're the police. We can protect you. And this is how the black market. I mean, this is in Russia's Secret Rulers. This book. Lev Timofeyev in the 90s. Very important book. He basically shows in this book how the mafia economy basically dominated in Russia and became its own kind of power. And the ideology served this power. This is The Soviet Mafia by Vaxberg. He was a courageous Soviet journalist who was the first to really write about these structures and how they work. And it's important for people to realize the work of a guy like that. It was originally shocking. There was assassinations hits put on him, and he talked about how the apparatus, how the police worked in Russia, how the MVD, the federal police in Russia, had this dominant position over the black market, and how the party apparatchiks on the local level. This is something that Saraska and Timofeyev write about. The local party bosses who got more power after Stalin's death, after they denounced Stalinism. Stalin used the secret police to control everybody. But then they said, well, let's give the secret police over to the local communists. That way we won't be able to use it to wipe people out, to wipe other communists out. Nobody killed more communists than Stalin did. But this had a corrupting effect on the whole mechanism. So the other lesson to take away from this situation is the people, the thugs who are in control of the Russian Federation and in control in China too, and other communist countries, they believe, it's ironic, they believe in Marxism, Leninism as a religion, and they believe partly because it serves their own personal interests. They can be like gods, and they can control the economy and have personal wealth at their disposal. It's not necessarily, people say, well, Putin's really the richest man in the world. Well, he doesn't have to own anything personally. Hitler was the same thing. What was Hitler's wealth? When you're a dictator and you control a country. You can command anything you want. You can have anybody killed you want. You can have anything you want. You can have that Rolex or whatever it is, the fancy clothes that Putin wears. But yet he still likes socialist ideas. He still praises the World Festival of Youth and Students. Why? Because it both is something he believes in, and it also is, there's a selfish thing there. He gets an advantage from it. And then he gets to think, well, I'm conquering these countries. I'm doing a good thing. It's a necessary bloodshed. You go back to the classics, right? they call the classics, Marx and Engels, Stalin and Lenin. And it's like, yeah, you have to kill a lot of people. You have to tell lies. You have to falsify reality. It's all part of the game. We're saving humankind. We're making the future for mankind. So it's a much more brutal, a basic Stalinist way of approaching the subject. And of course, all the true believers, they just believe. But in reality, these guys aren't the intellectuals. They're not Gorbachev. They're not Yakovlev, right? They're not really super bright when it comes to abstract ideas. So ultimately, they don't know what they're walking into. They don't understand what the Stalin system means. It means military defeat on the ground in Ukraine. It means an economy that's falling apart. The closer you get to mobilization, the closer you get to flatlining your own economy, like they have in China. You've got economists begging Xi Jinping, slow down, don't decouple with the United States, we'll collapse immediately, this kind of thing. And of course, but these guys don't understand economics. They don't have the brain power up here to understand these very difficult subjects. And so this is what puts us in this danger. They think, well, nuclear rockets, it's sort of a simple algorithm. It's like, well, the West has not kept up on its nuclear weapons. We've got them. We're getting hypersonic missiles out. We'll just nuke the United States and take everything, because these countries can't defend themselves against nukes. The French nuclear deterrent can be wiped out by SS-27s in Belarusia in 6 minutes. What chance does the British nuclear deterrent or the Israeli nuclear deterrent have against their sophisticated weapons? Well, they could make Israel an ally, right? Well, we won't bother with you. You're too small. Just take the United States, force Europe, to converge with Russia, force Latin America and Africa to become the colonies that they are openly of Russia and China, divide the world between Russia and China. It's very simple. You just use a few nuclear strikes and destroy the Americans, right? This is actually in Sokolovsky's Soviet military strategy. The nuclear missile weapon is the weapon of the next war. It is the decisive weapon. Well, what do you mean? What about the radiation? No, radiation isn't really a concern. It's about taking over the world. If the world is damaged, well, it's our world and we can fix it in time because we'll control the world from here on out. So what if there's Minnesota and Wisconsin are a giant desert because we wiped out the missile fields in the Dakotas? So we'll do something with the soil later on, maybe in 1,000 years, and they'll be growing crops there again. Big deal. And people do not in the West have a clue as to this mentality. They just don't. And they won't talk about it. And the fact that they classified the Clinton-Boris Yeltsin last meeting, where Yeltsin said to Clinton, give Europe to Russia, nobody's talking about it. Nobody in the West is talking about it. Nobody's acknowledging who these people are. And it's important to understand this evolution from Lenin to Stalin to Khrushchev to, and now we're Putin. This is Putin's a couple hat sizes shy of the brain power of Stalin.
Yeah, and it's also like how, science, real science has taught us about a psychopathic mind and a psychopathic brain, and really it's more common than people think. Some numbers put it at 1% of the population or truly true psychopaths, right? And even within that bracket of society, there's also a difference in the types of psychopaths. There's like some people came up with a psychopathic scale, and they say it goes up to 40 points. And some scientists, they've actually
abnormal personalities that are they're not psychopaths all the time, like borderline personality, narcissistic personality disorder, hysterical personality. One of the studies on Hitler said he was a hysteric, right?
Yeah, it's like we know about this phenomenon, and we know that some people like this Polish Polish academic Lobachevsky, he tried to not just look at the individual that's psychopathic, but he's trying to look at psychopathic groups and dynamics and how the Soviets would change Poland.
System.
how they would
created
find the right people or the wrong people and put them in the wrong places to change Poland and to Sovietize Poland. And this is something we can expect in other areas that may or may not fall under Russian control. It's that recipe where you find the collaborators and you have your own people and you have these psychopaths that you can put into certain positions. And it's like when that threshold is reached, when a person qualifies as a psychopath, there's no more moral limit. There's only physical boundaries. There's only capability limitations, but not moral limitations. So it's like when we have a pathological or a pathocracy, a pathological empire such as Russia or China, they are capable of anything, and science tells us they are capable of anything. And so it's like you can't be clouded. Dimension. You can't be clouded by a normalcy bias where you say, well, we haven't had an atomic war on a large scale yet, so it's never going to happen, or they wouldn't do that because it hasn't happened yet. It's like the most basic logical fallacy that you can think of, right?
Yeah,
right. It's like I mean, the guy. I mean, in every town, there's psychopaths running around, right? And it's like when people
sometimes they're running the town.
Yeah, and when people have no concept of safety, I mean, people who are trained in intelligence, they understand how dangerous humans can be, and they understand that sometimes you can't spot them, or it's harder to spot them, or it takes work to spot them, or to come up with a probability that somebody's a psychopath or an organization has become psychopathic. But the average citizen is still too trusting when it comes to other individuals, or even other individuals such as a dictator of another country. It's like how can people really think that you're dealing with anything less than pure psychopaths? They do not really qualify as human beings, because human beings are not just primitive, vicious little robots. We're not just primitive animals that just kill and eat and kill and eat and kill and eat. I mean,
the real problem is that psychopaths are human beings, and Colonel Stanislav Lunev was the one that brought this psychological element to my attention when I first met him. He said, I asked him, I said, are there any good people in Moscow, in the Kremlin, in the Russian general staff? And he looked at me like I'd asked a really stupid question. I felt rather foolish in that moment. And he said, these are not human beings. These are crazy persons. And then he began a lecture into what a psychopath is, and that Lenin had been a psychopath, that in the archives in Moscow, where they have 6,000 documents from Lenin, they will not release, because he is clearly, when you read it, you see he's a psychopathic, raving lunatic mass murderer, and this would destroy Lenin's reputation. Of course, Lunev was briefly studying to be an army lawyer. He had access to that library, and he actually read some of that. And he said, it destroyed my faith in socialism when I read that. And of course, he said that, these Russian generals, the people that go above the rank he was a colonel. He says, they're psychopaths. To be promoted to a certain level, they just promoted General Mordvichev to the commander of the land forces of the Russian Federation. He is like a psychopath in the way he struts about and talks. He's the one who flattened the Russian-Ukrainian city. It's a Ukrainian city whose population is Russian. They speak Russian. He flattened the city. He destroyed 90% of the city of Mariupol, one of the largest cities in Ukraine, to take it. The brutality of this general is astonishing. And what did he do? He got promoted for his brutality. So who promotes? I mean, he talks and he acts, and as a military commander behaved like a psychopath. He's probably killed more Russian-speaking people, because that area of Russia, the Ukrainians are ethnically, a lot of them are ethnically Russians. He did this, and he's proud of it. And he says, this war is going to be long because we have to liberate Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
What is he, crazy? Eastern Europe doesn't want to be liberated. Eastern Europe doesn't think they're under a yoke of oppression from the United States or NATO or the West. They like where they are. That's why they joined NATO, right? They don't want to be under the boot of Russia, real psychopaths. Those people don't understand. This is why this is so dangerous, and people don't, I remember Lunev told a room full of former U.S. officials when they were questioning, well, surely the Russian leadership doesn't want to, blow up shopping. They want a nice standard of living for themselves. They don't want a nuclear war. And he said, we trained for one mission and one mission only. In the Soviet military and the Russian Federation military, future nuclear world war with America. That was the main whole orientation of that military. And it hasn't changed. And it's not changed now. And the reason the army is so incompetent in Ukraine is they never thought they had to fight a conventional war. They were always going to march through the radiation of nuking their way through everything. So they didn't. Yeah, you don't need intensively trained soldiers if the way is opened with nuclear rockets. That's partly why they never upgraded their training system, their tactics, their doctrine. They didn't need to, because their doctrine was the nuclear missile doctrine, a.k.a. General Marshal V.D. Sokolovsky and his Soviet military strategy. It's about the nuclear rockets. Stupid. And nobody in the West will even open their eye. Oh, no, that's crazy. Nobody reads Sokolovsky anymore. It's not. It's like, but all these generals, all these guys who are in their 60s and late 50s now running the Russian Federation military, that was their bread and butter. They grew up reading that stuff in the 70s.
Yeah, it's like in the novel 1984. 1984 by George Orwell, whose real name wasn't really George Orwell, but that's a whole nother story. There's this. I think this is right at the end of the novel when the main character is captured and is getting tortured and brainwashed. I think it was at the end when the main character and we as the audience were told that a powerful ruling group needs to be able to train the next generation. The leaders, they have to grow the next generation of leaders. Otherwise, it's not gonna last. It's just a short period of rule, and they have to shape the next guys and have to do it in a certain way. So the program doesn't change. Now we saw this with these Russian guys. I mean, children of these hardcore people being groomed. Probably, I mean, you can probably think that this was the bread and butter when these guys, the new generation, even when they were children, like, this is the mission in life. There's nothing else in your life. You have to go to this university and join the SVR or whatever they call themselves these days. And you have to learn the game, and you have to prove yourself. You have to do these training missions, and you have to do the first real missions, and you have to do some bigger stuff, and you have to prove that you can be cold as ice. You have to prove that you feel different, that you're the KGB nobility, right? And then they get more and more responsibilities, and this is kind of this grooming process. Whereas in the West, with the politicians, it's different, right? I mean, it's like you have these business people, you have the politicians, and there's also some sort of a grooming process. But this can go wrong very, very much so. I mean, we've seen this in Europe for centuries and centuries when the next generation isn't behaving as intended. Because they're getting soft, they're getting too fond of the luxury, and they're getting too much into alcohol and drugs, and they don't want to do the work, right? Because they're the chosen ones. They're the little princess, right? But they don't function right. This is kind of something that every psychopathic organization or group has to figure out how to produce the next generation of leaders and not have it derail.
We have to look at Trump administration, J.D. Vance, and the people that are running the United States. And, you could say there's a spectrum of mental illness maybe, but Voegelin would deny. He would say, no, it's not a mental illness. He would say it's a spiritual sickness. Instead of, he called it pneumopathology rather than psychopathology, a sickness of the spirit. And he really underscored this sickness of the spirit as being the real root cause of all this politically. And, people have commented about Trump being a narcissist. It's very controversial, of course. But we've watched his behavior. And the things that he says, there's a lack of contact with reality with Trump. When he will say things like, Zelensky should have never started this war. It's like saying, Zelensky didn't start the war. Unless your philosophy is that the people who start wars are the people that defend themselves against aggression, not the aggressor. Because remember, it's only when the defender actually tries to stop aggression that the war begins. Otherwise, the aggressor just runs right over and there's no war. Or he just captures without resistance. So unless that's Trump's philosophy, which it would be a very twisted kind of philosophy to say that military aggressors never start the wars. It's the people that try to defend themselves against them that start the wars. They're the bad ones. They're the ones that should have never started the war. They should have just surrendered, right? They had no business taking on a country 3 times their size. Yeah. This is a moral idiot. And I've said this before. People say, you say President Trump is an idiot. No, I say he's a moral idiot, which is much worse. And again, I think there's a spiritual pathology in Trump. There's a sickness there. For him to even say that, it's extremely alarming to me. I voted for him.
When I see a person exhibiting behaviors, the sort of behaviors that we saw from Trump, the lack of accountability, always blaming somebody else, something else, and always claiming to have the best and be the best and the greatest this and the greatest that. People claiming they can do anything and they can make anything happen in 24 hours or make it happen in a week. When I see behaviors like this, I always sense a sense of fear in that person. Of a fear of not being that or not being good enough, or it's trying too hard. These people they're trying too hard. It's over the top, and it's like I think there's an element of fearfulness in Trump because he's a human being, right? Human beings, they fail. Their health fails. He's not doing too well. He's really old now, and people are starting to talk more and more about his cognitive situation. So there's that. There's the physical failure, and also there's business failures. There's failures of oops, I broke another law. Oops, I broke another law. Oh, I'm in trouble again. And it's like I think he's always had ample reason to be fearful because he was like a shark mingling with other sharks. I mean, when you're in New York and you're competing with other people, and to some degree, I think he's trying, again, out of fear, to scare others off. If you're so over the top and you seem so aggressive and you seem so driven, so incredibly driven, I think it's also supposed to fend people off, to make other people think, I'm not going to mess with this guy. I'm not going to do that because it's going to be too much hassle. I think there's also that. I think Trump is still hard to read. There was this exclusive story, I believe it was, in the Wall Street Journal. It says, European officials say Trump tells their leaders Putin is not ready to end the war. It says, on a call Monday, President Trump told European leaders that Russian President Putin is not ready to end the war in Ukraine because Putin thinks he's winning, according to 4 senior European officials familiar with the conversation. It says, so then the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, had to make, to respond to these news reports, writing in an email that Trump did say he believes Putin is winning the war, but he never said Putin isn't ready to end war. So it's statement against statement. One of the European officials who participated in the call said that Trump began Monday's discussion by saying, I think Vladimir does not want peace. Not want peace. Trump, the official said, told the people on the call that the war was going well for Putin and that he would therefore keep fighting. And so there's this one thing being said in public. Oh, it's going good. There's going to be peace and trade and everything's going to be just great. Greatest thing ever. Perfect, greatest thing ever. But outside of the public, outside of the the cameras and the studio lights, Trump says something else. Trump actually says something that's closer to reality. I mean, not necessarily about Putin winning. That's not really the case. But Putin thinking he can win, and so Putin does not want peace. So this is why it's so hard to go by any public statement of Trump or when people have commented forever on, Trump's business deals, the one thing I just mentioned earlier in this show, selling a property that's worth 40 million, selling it for almost 100 million to a Russian guy. And then Wilbur Ross in his fancy dealings in Cypress and Trump's dealings with Deutsche Bank, and then Deutsche Bank getting caught laundering a lot of money for the Russians. And there were some people associated with Deutsche Bank, I think the risk management, that ended up dead. Forgot what the names were, but this was in the press. Not a big splash in the press, but it was there. Some guy who had all these kind of papers wanting to get public, and then he's dead all of a sudden. I saw all that. I saw all of the stuff, but I think it's harder to read. Because it's like, how do you get to Russians? How do you get to powerful Russians? I mean, in the old days in the Soviet Union, oh my God, you had to find some Soviet guy who's on a foreign trip, and then you had to stage an elaborate operation to maybe talk to him for a bit off the record, or maybe catch him and try to initiate something and try to get something going with this person, just some talking, right? It was so hard, and you couldn't just send people over to the Soviet Union. I mean, all the diplomats were surveilled 10 times over. Hard to shake your tail and talk to some Russian guy and maybe even recruit somebody. But nowadays, you can just say, I have a property to sell. I need money urgently. I'm in trouble. If only somebody could help me. And then some Russian guy comes and say, I'm going to buy that property off of you for almost 100 million. I mean, that's also a way to lure these Russians in, to get these Russians to get them to talk, to make contact with them. So I think the whole Trump thing is one of the hardest cases to read. It's such a confusing mess of different things. And it's like, yeah, the easy answer would be Trump is so hyper focused on himself and the moment. I have a problem. I need a quick fix now, and I'll worry about the details later, or not worry about it at all. I'll just play the victim again. That's of course a significant way to read into this, and sometimes we shouldn't overcomplicate our thinking. Sometimes it's not just the simplest answer is always the right one. Sometimes it's a very complex answer that's the right one. Sometimes it's a medium, mid-level complicated answer. But I'm still not. It's because it's so confusing what this whole Trump saga was. And still, I mean, Trump just announced, what was it, the new chief of staff or the military, this high-ranking military guy. he picks a guy who's totally anti-Russia, and he picks other people who kind of get it, who are anti-Russia, and Trump is saying one thing in public. It's not my war. It's not my war. It's not my problem, right? It's not my problem.
Yeah, Trump is Mr. Magoo. He's got a walking stick.
But he wants to win too. But he's fanatical about winning too. And it's like if he can win by getting a deal with the Russians, I think his motivation is to win over to win against the Russians.
But he doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know what he's doing, and he doesn't know how to do it. I mean, if you say, I'm going to flap my arms and fly to the moon, I just have to figure out how, and we're going to win by flying to the moon with flapping our arms. It's just crazy talk. I mean, a lot of the things he talks about are just impractical. He's not going to do what he's saying he's going to do. There's no way to get from here to there. And that's one way to understand him. I mean, look, I'll repeat what I've said about Hesiod saying there's three kinds of men. There's men who can think and give good advice. There's men who can take good advice. And there's men that can't think or give good advice or take good advice. And I think Trump is the latter type of man. And I think a lot of the people around him are. I think Hegseth is. I think J.D. Vance is. They're people that shouldn't be in a position of responsibility because they can't think for themselves and they don't actually know how to listen to people who do. So what they do is the Mr. Magoo thing. They bump into walls because they're blind, because they can't think, and they just sort of feel their way with a walking stick.
So how to change?
Maybe not fall into the basement.
So how to change the GOP, really? Because I always said that, with Trump's first administration and Trump's second administration, I said, it's like you shouldn't vote Democrat. It is what it is. You shouldn't vote Democrat, but don't get caught up in the hype. Go out and vote Republican, but you need to put in the effort to start changing the GOP. Just find better people and find new ideas, or find some good old ideas that were forgotten, right? So how to change the GOP when there's all this propaganda out there, especially propaganda amplified by the Russians, propaganda in the West that tries to define what a conservative is supposed to be. Some of this propaganda says a conservative needs to, love the Nazis, or a conservative needs to be completely backwards, or it's always, conservatives, it's always going to be the same. The GOP will always be the same. There's not supposed to be any change. I think this is kind of the major point of the Russians. They do not want the GOP to change. They do not want the Republicans to professionalize and figure out better ways of finding the next level generation of talent. Right? Because if you're an up-and-coming politician, if you have the format, if you have a background, a professional background, you have credibility, you need media traction. You need to be seen. You need to be amplified. And what do you do if your competitors are being amplified, who say pro-Russian stuff and who just play the audience and sometimes are clownish, and therefore keeping the GOP weaker. So how to change the GOP?
Change the GOP? Trump has changed it. And the problem is the right in America has changed. The intellectual level, going from William F. Buckley, the patron saint of the conservatives, he had a certain intellectual level coming out of National Review. You had the Weekly Standard. Later on, you had of course, he's discredited, right, because he's a neocon. I'm not remembering his name, but then you had the American Spectator, Terrell's magazine. Very smart, witty, publication. All of these publications their standards have declined somewhat. And there's the breakup of the Soviet Union sort of broke up the right, because what the right was in America was people who didn't agree about a lot of things, who agreed about one thing, that we needed to be together to stop the left, to stop the communists. And there was that kind of feeling. Once the Soviet Union fell, you could get a Clinton elected president. You'd have this kind of breaking of the Republican Party. Remember, you had Pat Buchanan emerge, and of course he won the first primary in one election cycle. He won the first primary in New Hampshire. I think that was in '92 against George W. Bush, if I remember right. And it's like all of a sudden there's this part of the Republican Party that's populist, that is almost America first, that is more nationalist, opposed to international. I mean, it really didn't start with Trump. This kind of thing was always kind of waiting in the wings, and it has a certain flavor from between the wars, before America became the superpower. There's this desire to go back to that, and it's that whole thing, that whole argument, paleocons and neocons, and it's all degenerated from there into what we see today. I think there's a general degeneration, and I don't think the younger conservatives even know the literature of their movement going back to the 1950s. They're not really even familiar with it, and those that are, they've somehow lost the ability to think the problems through. I think there's a deficit. There's an intellectual deficit, just as there is in Russia, and I've said this before, and in China. The leaders aren't as bright. The people doing things aren't as well read.
I mean, nowadays people tend to think that Jordan Peterson is hyper intelligent. They believe he has a IQ above 150. He's the smartest thing ever. While he's giving you some very baseline stuff that you can find anywhere else.
Bed,
and then,
right? Make your bed.
Yeah, and values, and he's married and stuff, and blah blah blah. And it's like. But
he was addicted to some drugs.
He specializes. He's trained in, I think, therapy for addicts. That is what he's specialized in. But anything beyond that, I've never seen an original idea of him. I've never seen even that he's aware of the key literature, other people's ideas. He doesn't even have the overview.
Did you see his debate with Slavoj Žižek? Did you see that?
No. God, no.
Slavoj Žižek is a Slovenian Marxist.
Yeah, that guy. He looks like a hobo. He looks like
Yeah, he's sort of a comical figure, but he wrote a very good book on Lenin. I mean, from a communist point of view, and he is very intelligent and very smart. He debated Peterson, and this is a good example. If you follow his debate with Peterson, all that Peterson did, and it was a debate over communism, and Peterson was going to take the anti-communist point of view against Zizek, and it became a joke because the only thing that Peterson did to prepare was read the Communist Manifesto of 1848, as if communism wasn't a huge history after that it evolved, and it had all these different figures and ideas. And Zizek was at one point just simply correcting him in his mistakes. At one point, he was confusing communism with the idea of equality. And Zizek says, Marx never wrote anything about equality. He just corrected him right there. There's no business of equality in Karl Marx. It's each according to his ability, each according to his need. And you could tell these things had never occurred to Peterson. He didn't have any knowledge here. He's debating a subject he knows nothing about. It's a very dangerous thing to do. So when Peterson, with his psychology, and this is the thing in the social sciences, you want to be interdisciplinary. I've studied a lot of psychology as a political science person. And you need to study history, and you need to study economics and so on. But Peterson doesn't have that. And so when he diverges from his expertise, and I just can't help pointing out, this is a guy who gives people personal advice, who ends up so badly addicted to drugs that he almost dies.
Yeah, and he needs Russian help to fix his problem, and also
which is really troubling. Yeah,
it's like so people think they they got what they need. They listen to this person, and he's got the suit on, and he's got the stern look on his face, and like, it's like I noticed something that people tend to follow public figures that seem like your personal doctor that you would trust. You know that when doctors, they have to put on a bit of an act, right? They have to appear smarter than they are, and good-willing, and like a father figure, and beyond that even, you know, like this, there's a certain style to it. I call it the personal doctor that you would trust. And Peterson has that nailed. So people follow this guy and they think, well, I got what I need, right? There's the philosophy aspect, there's the history aspect, there's this and that. But you get the superficial stuff, especially when it comes to Russia. You know, he doesn't want to. He's kind of mingling with these Russian ideas. He's been to Russia. His daughter was, I think is maybe goes in that direction. And it's like why can't we get some clear words from Jordan Peterson on Russia and the situation that we're in? Why is it the same whining of, oh, we're in decline, we need some more values? We need more than that. We need a lot more than that. And it's just like the internet age of you barely find anything worthwhile on the internet. The internet is ubiquitous. It's everywhere, right? But you know, who has a library? Who has a personal library? I mean, I had people. I said, you know, you have to start with assembling your own library of about 200 titles. That's like a good, reasonable goal. And then some people said, "Are you crazy? 200 books? That sounds like a million books." And I did a short video of one of my shelves, just a smaller shelf, and I said, "Okay, look at this. This little shelf is roughly 200 books. That's achievable. I mean, over the years, if you start reading, right? This is achievable. Don't think that, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of podcasts can replace good information. You don't find it on the internet. The internet is more or less, for the most part, a waste of time. And it's like, with algorithms, it's tailored to your taste. They kind of know what you're going for. Especially if you don't have a proper father, they give you a father figure. They give you this Santa Claus type, doctor type guy who has that routine nailed. Right? And people can play any kind of role. I mean, this one Russian guy is playing the role of a young prince. Somebody else is playing the role of a right-winger. Somebody else is playing a different role. And it's like to change the Republican Party. To change the Republican Party, we have to go at the very bottom of these Russian influence operations, and to say that, you know, sometimes you're just looking at a mole. A high level mole can destroy the perception of a section of the Republican Party. He can.
If you didn't have an intellectual deficit in the party to begin with, and among the right in America to begin with, you couldn't have this kind of influence succeed. You know, you have the term useful idiot that Lenin coined about these people who believed in socialism and wanted to help the Soviet Union and would do anything. Now the Russian Federation has useful idiots on the right. I think there always have been useful idiots on the right, but now it's become a pandemic, or, you know, it's just crazy. So I think there is this problem that people don't read. And it goes back to Marshall McLuhan and Neil Postman's comments, and the effect of television has had on the mind. Anyone who taught school, I taught school in the 1980s, and I can tell you it was very difficult because you're competing with television. And the main medium is entertainment, because television is an entertainment media. It's not an educational medium. And now, you know, I remember the vice principal of the school I went to, don't talk to them for more than 2 minutes. You'll lose control of the class. You're not an entertainer. You can't hold their attention. Their attention span has been governed by TV. This is what they grew up with. This is 40 years ago now. I was told this. So I have to say that there's a catastrophe that's happened, which has not been registered by people, and there's no, you can't just remedy it by saying stop watching TV and start reading, because people won't do it. And they just elected a TV star, because Trump is essentially a reality TV star, to be president. It was one thing when they elected Ronald Reagan, because Ronald Reagan actually was a reader. He actually read things. But it's another thing now when you're looking at what we have now. And this was a part of my theme of my book about, origins of the Fourth World War, what it was going on in education. It was all a lie. We weren't improving it. In the late 1980s, when they were talking about education reform, we weren't. And the only good thing is the Marxists didn't get very far either, except they got a lot of pathologically, as you said, pathologically motivated people who would go right for Marxism. If you had a psychological problem and you were studying social science, you would become a Marxist, because it appeals to your sickness, your own personal sickness, in various ways. It's calculated for that. And nobody really has done the analysis of why things turned out the way they. Oh, we got the peace dividend. We won the Cold War. Everything's going to come up roses now. No, it didn't. We're on the verge of nuclear world war in Europe right now, and the Chinese won a war in the Pacific, and China and Russia are aligned, and America hasn't built itself. We're even unwilling to keep the military as strong as it was 10 years ago. The Army's going to shrink. The Navy's been shrinking. The Air Force has shrunk quite a bit. And the nuclear forces are rotting away. They are. It's a fact. And people want to cover it up. They lie in the press all the time about it. It's not true. The Russians and Chinese are building new weapons, new generations. They're shifting to massive military production. The West won't do it. Having Sweden do it, having Finland raise the troops. Now, these are small countries that are very scared. But it takes a big country. It takes a major European country, France, Germany, the UK. No, they've gotten sucked into this welfare state where all their money is going to pay for stuff for people. People are no longer responsible for themselves. The state is responsible for them, and it's expensive. And the state can't now afford to defend. Well, wait a minute. Government was established among men to make sure they have a comfortable retirement and that they have health care? That's why government was established? No, I don't think so. I think it was about defense against enemies. If you go back and read historians in the 19th century, yes, government's all about defending the society against enemies, foreign and domestic. Can they do that now effectively? No, they're all about health. Let's see if we can get you more health care, get you a better retirement when you're old. Let's take over more industries, have the state run them. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, it's if people read into the literature on, strong personality flaws, and then it gets into these more serious mental problems or personality problems, and then it gets to the real pathologies. But even if you have somebody who is medium level, dysfunctional or has significant character flaws, it's really, really hard to get this person out of there or to motivate this person to make the effort to change. It's some of the hardest things to get rid of. It's almost like a serious addiction. It's the same with people say, well, I don't have a drinking problem because I'm not lying in a ditch. I don't have 10 DUIs. I have it under control, but they keep drinking and drinking and drinking. And I think it's the same with even more significant character flaws that cloud your judgment and obscure your ability to make good decisions. Because it's like with alcoholism, when people say, well, I have it under control. I have my flaws under control because I'm not totally crazy. I'm not totally dysfunctional, but there's still massive problems. And it's like when people, or when I see comments on videos, specific types of videos, like Jordan Peterson and some of the guys that we have in Europe, they call themselves academics, and especially this is so, it's straight out of the Soviet playbook. They call themselves experts on peace. Like, they understand peace, like where it comes from, how we get it, and so on. But it's their idea is always to give in to Moscow. So we have these guys, and they act the same way. They want to create this feel-good impression on the audience. And when I look at the comments, there's always a bunch of people saying, "Oh, it feels so good listening to that person," even if it's superficial garbage or even if it's dangerous garbage. But it's like oh, it makes me feel so good. It makes me feel calmer. It's like I'm thinking, are you guys, are you men, or are you unstable young girls? Because who thrives on feelings? Who thrives on feelings all the time? I mean, I have feelings. I have a lot of rational thought, and I think it does align. I mean, I get emotions about rational thoughts, and I also get rational thoughts about emotions. It does work together, but I don't get to pick and choose, how I feel all of the time. This is not what reality is.
Market society is a society with a free market that is able to produce more and more things and has commercial advertising and so on. It's you have the tendency, you're always appealing to people. This will make you feel good. Take this product, use this product. It'll make you better. And this is what you see. And of course, there's this tendency of this to become hedonism, to slip into it. And then when you add television, look at the ultimate drug is sitting there being entertained, having your dopamine levels increased by watching an exciting shoot 'em up on TV or the movies or playing a video game. This is where people are going to get this feeling of well-being that these things create, and we have to be very careful because life requires a lot of grit. Because there's a lot of things we have to do in life that are very unpleasant. We have to get through things. And people say, "Oh, I just can't do that. And it's too hard." This is what I got when I had students, and I would give a difficult assignment. It's like, "It's too hard, Mr. Nyquist. Don't give us this assignment." They didn't want to do anything hard because it's a challenge. It's tough. And, the moral muscles and the muscles of, being tough, being stronger. What is it? No pain, no gain. What was that? Jack LaLanne? Somebody back when I was a kid was saying this. No pain, no gain. It's true. You get stronger when you put yourself through something more difficult. People are less and less into that business of getting a challenge, and this is also a problem of Western society. And we haven't had frank discussions of this. People feel very uncomfortable about it. You don't want to be, carrying around a whip and whipping yourself in the back and, going to the masochism end of the scale. No, that's not what I'm saying. There's a balance in life and in everything. And I think that the West has fallen out of balance. And whereas the East has got its own criminal structures and imbalances, the West is differently pathological than the East. And the bad part about it is that this pathology in the West and the pathology of the East seems to conspire to create a war of mass destruction in which the West does not rise to the occasion, and the East, as weak as it is, says, "Oh, we can take these guys," right? A big misunderstanding, and we can throw some nukes and take over the world. Right? And then the crazy people in the West going, "Oh, they would never do that. I mean, that's crazy. Nuclear war would be the end of the world." So each side has a delusion. One that it can't happen because it's too terrible. The other that, "Oh yeah, it can happen and we can make it. We can do it because those people are so soft and weak." This is the situation we've gotten into.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the whole KGB way of things, right? When you, there's so much literature now that most people never get to see, right? About KGB training, or some people in Stasi, East Germany, and they picked some tough people. I mean, they had a rigorous selection process, and they were demanding the most out of these people, to to be behind enemy lines and to play a role for a long time, or to carry out assassinations or poisonings and whatever. And there's like this anecdote. There was this young guy, and he was and he embarked on a Stasi career, right? So usually what they would do is they would put you into the service of a border patrol unit, right? And this is and there were, in the last days of Soviet Eastern Germany, there was still a lot of young men in these embedded in these border units to be then moved over to full Stasi training. And so some of them were already in the process of migrating over to the full Stasi training, but then, you know, their country was gone. And then they always said they were never Stasi, but then we get the files and we know that they were basically on their way to the full training. And there was this one guy, he said that, I'm in this border unit and they give me some standard missions, right? They give me some training missions. I have to sit all night in the cold, you know, very little food, no entertainment, nobody to talk to. I have to sit in the middle of nowhere and observe an area and give a report if something happens. And of course, that guy is bored to death all night, but he's being observed. He's being observed by the Stasi trainers, and they check out if he falls asleep, if he gives a false report, if he has the grit to carry out that assignment, even if it seems stupid to him, even if it seems pointless to him and just miserable. And so he starts doing those kind of things, and then they assign him to a new mission. They say, okay, right over there, you see the border fence. It was not just a wall, as some people think. It was just border fences and some other types of border fortifications. And they say, here's the fence. There's a secret spot where you can cross through the fence. And we give you an object, and you have to go through the fence to the other side, to West Germany, and you have to put that object in a certain place, you know, wooded area, and then you have to return. And so he takes that object, he goes through the fence, and he goes to the spot, and he puts down this object, and he looks around, and he's somewhere in the bushes. He sees a pack of cigarettes, which is an Eastern brand, not a Western brand. And he's thinking, I'm probably not really in the West. This is not the real border fence. This is just a mock-up. This is fake. This is a test. So because he was tempted to just keep going, keep running, and defect basically to the West. But he saw that pack of cigarettes and thought, no, they're fooling me. This is a test. I'm still in East Germany. And so he safely returned, and eventually he did get confirmation that he was never in the West. You know, this is the kind of stuff. This is just the beginning of things. You know, when they figure out who you really are. And yeah. And it gets crazier and crazier. They demand more sacrifices until that's your whole identity. I mean, you keep doing this and you sacrifice, and that's all you are.
A lot of life was like that in the past. People lived very poor. They didn't have very good opportunities. They would have to prove themselves through very difficult life experiences. You know, human beings were poor. You go before the 19th century and illness, the death rate, and then, you know, even in 1900, the average lifespan of an American male was 50 years. And less so in centuries before that. We don't realize to the extent that science and the rising of the standard of living has made our existence less tragic, less horrific. People really suffered. And a lot of people in the third world today in the poor countries are suffering. And of course, people do get used to suffering. That is true. There is a more adaptability to it. We get more tender-footed and softer by living this kind of life, and that again is a reason to worry. You look at how tough the Russians are, sacrificing themselves in such large numbers in this front in Ukraine, and how tough the Ukrainians are to stand up to this huge threat. What could Western nations endure the same? I wonder. I think so, but I wonder. When you've got, I think it's 43% of Americans are obese, not just overweight, obese, right? That's almost half. That's closing in on half of people being obese, and obese is dangerously overweight.
I think we're seeing a shift right now because it's because of the economy, because of the job market, people finally have realized it's really tough out there. It's really grim out there. You can't screw around anymore. You can't get into student loan debt for some degree that's useless. And you can't just think that your 20s are going to last forever. You're just going to use all your 20s to figure out what you want and who you are, and you just mess around with stupid career choices that go nowhere. Or you think, I'm just gonna get a guy and get pregnant and have like 2 kids, and I'm gonna be a stay-at-home mom, blah 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 blah. It's gonna be real tough if you choose to have children, and people realize that now. I mean, it's all over social media, and not everybody is interpreting the situation. Not everybody is interpreting it in a Marxist way, that we all have to complain, we all have to strike, and we all have to bring things to a grinding halt and then have a big change and everybody gets a share.
Well, that didn't work.
But it's like people understand that no matter how much you vote Democrat, or no matter how much you just virtue signal some stuff that you copy from the internet, it's not going to be good for your bank account. It's not going to be good for your life. And a lot of these people out there who are very ideological, a lot of these people are losers. I mean, it's like you shouldn't necessarily judge another person just by how much his net worth is, how expensive his watch is, and all that stuff. But I think it becomes increasingly clear that there's no alternative to the grind and being inventive and just being creative and figuring out ways to improve yourself and improve your life, because nothing else works. I mean, how many generations of political baloney have we seen? Democratic presidents come and go, leftist trends come and go, and nothing ever gets better with that. I mean, it's like these people. It's like this cult that was waiting for the return of the comet or something. One of these cults, and they say, well, it's gonna come in 5 years. That's when the comet comes and the spaceship, and we're all gonna be saved. And then the time arrives and nothing happens. And then they say, we miscalculated. It's gonna be another 5 or 10 years. I mean, eventually people are gonna be just so disappointed in that and stick to grinding. There's no alternative to just to be tough and get things done.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think we've run out of time, and it's time to end the broadcast. We've covered a lot of ground. We've discussed some fundamental problems of the West and the East. My name is Jeff Nyquist. This has been Friends and Enemies. My co-host, Alex Benesch in Germany. I'm in the U.S. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.